All right, time for our fiscal focus segment brought to you by InfoChoice, your choice of information on Australian consumer finance. This week's topic is housing construction, which is a big one considering all the issues we're having with housing supply at the moment. Joining us to discuss is Tom Devitt, who's the senior economist at the Housing Industry Association. G'day, Tom. Welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Tom. So just give us a broad sort of beat on what's happening in the dwelling construction and approvals sector at the moment. There's a few challenges. So what's really holding the construction sector back at the moment, particularly when it comes to residential homes?
You're right. There are quite a few challenges in the industry, especially this year, 2024, where we're pretty much reaching the end of what I think has probably been the most well-broadcast housing downturn in recent memory. We at HIA have been predicting since mid-2022, when the Reserve Bank first started increasing interest rates, that this was going to happen. Sales of new homes fell off a cliff pretty much straight away, and this has been progressively filtering through to all the other data points: housing finance, building approvals, house commencements, and now we're finally starting to see a very sharp decline in the number of houses that are actually under construction. And that's going to be a big challenge for a number of builders this year, depending on how much work they have to continue on with and depending how quickly and strongly the market turns around in the second half of this year.
Thomas, the government has set a pretty ambitious goal, well, ambitious considering the current circumstances the industry is in, of building 1.2 million homes, new homes, within the next 5 years. So I think that works out to about 240,000 homes per year. How are we tracking towards reaching that goal?
It is ambitious, but it's not unachievable. We have done those kind of volumes before during the or almost those kind of volumes during the apartment boom between 2014 and 18. We were doing about 225,000 a year. During the peak of the pandemic, we at least started. We didn't complete because of other issues constraining the industry, but we started about 230,000 homes in that year, and we have a lot more construction workers now than we did during either of those two booms. So these kind of targets are achievable, but there needs to be policy reforms to actually achieve it. Business as usual won't get there. At the moment, HIA's official forecasts, which are based on the assumption that none of the desired policy reforms come through, we're forecasting a little over 1 million new homes to commence construction over the next 5 years. So it's well short of the 1.2 million we need, but there's a very clear laundry list of policy reforms that we've been pressing all the relevant policymakers for a number of years now, and that could very much get us to those kind of numbers.
For sure. And we'll get onto those policy reforms needed in a little bit, but we'll just take a trip down memory lane, I suppose. What sort of caused this huge logjam? Now, you mentioned RBA interest rate rises starting in 2022, but there's going to be a multitude of factors that led up to that, right? And it's a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. So was this kind of seeded in the COVID era? And what, besides interest rate rises, has led to this issue?
You're right. Interest rates aren't the only factor. They're just the loudest one that gets most of the attention. But interest rate increases had compounded the increases in construction costs that were already underway. The materials costs that surged during the pandemic, and more recently and ongoing, the labour costs as well. So the cost of building a new home has gone up by over 100,000. Around 30 to 40%, depending on the market and depending on the type of housing since the pandemic began. So interest rates have compounded that, and on top of that, there are the other policy decisions that compound those costs, like stamp duty, like the financial regulators who put restrictions on how much banks can lend and how much people can borrow, and importantly, how much local and state authorities constrain how much medium density housing can be undertaken in existing suburbs, not just on in the outer suburbs sprawling outwards, but medium density units and townhouses. Not even talking skyscrapers in the CBD. That kind of missing middle of development is going to be very important in the coming years and decades.
We'll get on to the policy reform now, Thomas. So what are the top key areas of policy reform that HIA would like to see to get construction going in this country?
No, well, number one would be stamp duty. We've been calling for that to be abolished for a long time and replaced with a fairer tax. It matters less what they replace it with, just that they get rid of it. Stamp duty is one of the worst taxes available. It's tens of thousands of dollars hit on often first home buyers precisely when they can least afford it. So that's a major obstacle to actually getting over the line. We'd like to see the regulators being less restrictive on how much people can borrow and how much banks can lend. That's a real legacy of the GFC. It's kind of ironic that Australia mostly escaped the GFC better than any other country, but we reacted to it in terms of our banking regulations more than anyone else. So our banking regulations are very, very conservative by international standards. And in the regulators' words, it's helping them create that unquestionably strong financial sector, but it's increasingly squeezing more and more people out of the market, especially first-time buyers and those at the lower end. And as I mentioned as well, planning reforms that speed up the release of new land and increase the development of high-density dwellings in existing suburbs where jobs and transport already exist. Those are the key policy reforms that we're really pushing for.
Now, Tom, I understand you're a Melbourne-based lad, and if we look to Melbourne recently as a sort of case study, we saw that Brisbane's median home value overtook Melbourne, and there doesn't seem to be, just on the surface, like I could be wrong on this, there doesn't seem to be on the surface as many sort of things holding Melbourne back from getting homes built, having a more dense city area. Is Melbourne doing something different? Are they doing anything better, or is this just some other issue that I haven't thought of?
Melbourne is probably the most constrained market in the country right now. Melbourne lost a lot of its residents during the pandemic to other states, especially as you mentioned, southeast Queensland. A lot of people moved north. A lot of people from Sydney as well. Sydney and Melbourne moved to WA and South Australia, basically everywhere that wasn't locked down. So Melbourne in particular, but also Sydney, are very much dependent on the return of overseas migrants to get their populations back to their pre-pandemic trajectories. And it's true that the bounce back of overseas migration has been much stronger than most of us expected it would be. But in Melbourne, we still haven't caught back up to where we were expecting we were going to be by 2024 when we were making our forecasts back in 2019. So that's one of the things that's holding Melbourne back. Relatively speaking, we've had less population growth and there's less underlying demand. There's still plenty. You can just look at rental vacancy rates around the country, including in Melbourne, and they're at record lows, 1%. They need to be between 3 and 5% for there to be a fairer balance between renters and landlords. So there's still an acute shortage of housing in Melbourne. It's just not as acute as some of those other markets.
Back to policy reform, Thomas. What about on the workforce side? We're seeing this morning Master Builders Australia coming out saying labour shortages and industrial relations changes will counter the measures to increase supply, especially given productivity has fallen 18% in the last decade. So what do you make of that?
Productivity in the construction industry is notoriously hard to measure, so I'm always wary of headlines like that. But what's beyond argument is, yes, the industry has been facing acute shortages of skilled tradespeople during the pandemic, especially bricklayers, carpenters, roofers, ceramic tilers. Those are the major shortages. Now, when international borders reopened in late 2021, we did see a market improvement in those shortages. The shortages did ease. They've kind of stalled because there's also a lot of demand for construction workers from public infrastructure projects and mining projects and other non-residential sectors. So that's keeping demand for skilled trades high. But as I said, the total number of construction workers across the country is higher now than it's ever been before. And as long as we continue to have access to skilled workers from overseas, and importantly, keep training up our existing workforce, that means public support for not just for apprenticeships, but publicly marketing and promoting careers in the industry and the prospects and potential for kids to get into the industry. That's all going to help us meet some of the housing volumes that the government want to see achieved.
For sure. And you kind of touched on it just there, but there's been some research done that homes now take 12 months to be fully constructed, and that's up from 8.5 sort of pre-pandemic. And it's easy to talk about, bigger ideas and policy reforms and stuff. But what does this actually mean for the tradies on the ground? Like, how can they be supported to build these homes quicker and more efficiently without all this red tape and all these log jams happening? Like, what does this mean for the people that are actually doing the work?
Well, number one would be for governments to pause any further changes to the construction code and to building regulations, which end up requiring more and more labour and more hours of work and more effort and more resources without actually resulting in any more houses getting built. So that's a big challenge for the industry. That's one of the first things people look at when they're trying to assess productivity, the fact that we have so many more workers in the construction industry now, but we're not really building that many more houses. And one of the big culprits for that is because there's so much more involved now in building a house in terms of regulations than there were in the 70s and the 80s. So number one would be for the government to pause any of those further changes, especially this year when the industry is facing the challenges that it is.
People are told from a home buying perspective to avoid, high-rise apartments built in the last 10 years. And there's all these new regulations and there's all these tradies that are on job sites and stuff. But as you said, there's all this new regulation, but really no increase in construction. And despite the regulation, it seems like everyone's chasing a sort of brick build from the 70s. Just a comment from me there.
We think there's plenty of underlying demand for that high density stuff. It's just that in a number of markets it's easier to build out on the outskirts. Not necessarily the best way to design a city, to just continually spread outwards. So that trend needs to be reversed. But there's always going to be that part of the market. Australia has built around 100,000 detached houses in the outer suburbs a year since the 80s, since the 70s. That seems to be Australia's upper limit for detached housing. The rest needs to be those units and townhouses and apartments to get us over 200,000.
One thing that obviously is mentioned a lot when it comes to talking about all the issues with housing supply and housing shortages is the fact that we have quite high levels of immigration at the moment. And then those defending sort of high levels of immigration say, well, we've got all these worker shortages. We need more people in to build these homes. But then I often think, isn't that in a way you're kind of going around in circles because you're bringing in people to build more homes, but then those people you brought in need more homes built for them too, and then you just keep needing to bring more people in. So what do you think of all that stuff?
You're right. It is a bit of a catch-22, especially because most of the arrivals in the last couple of years have been students rather than the skilled trades that we actually need. Australia's immigration system historically has been very much biased towards people with university qualifications rather than the kind of skilled trades that we need. And it certainly hasn't helped that we completely turned off the immigration taps during the pandemic and turned them back on. This kind of whiplash of people coming and going isn't sustainable. What we need is strong but stable inflows of overseas workers and other overseas arrivals to not just support the overall size of the economy continuing to tick over, but overseas immigration is great for an economy in terms of innovation, in terms of business creation, productivity, wage growth. Everything benefits from immigration except housing if you don't build enough of it.
Plenty to think about there. Tom Devitt, thanks for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar podcast. We really appreciate your thoughts on construction and the housing woes currently in Australia at the moment.
No worries. Thanks for having me.